Murray Rothbard's criticisms of Hayek as mentioned in Murray N. Rothbard versus the Philosophers. Criticism of Hayek. Historical rights and natural rights. Rothbard's criticism of Hayek's formulation, both evolutionist and fallibilist, is closely connected to the discussion of natural law. The fact that Hayekian and Rothbardian premises are irreconcilable emerges in the two reviews of Constitution of Liberty. To explain the reasons for liberty, Hayek starts from evolutionary and fallibilist positions that are inevitably going to contrast with the doctrine of natural law and rationalism, the latter being the premises for Rothbard's anarcho-capitalist theory. In Rothbard's opinion, one of the shortcomings of Hayek's work is that he totally ignores the tradition of natural law, even when discussing theorists who were actually great supporters of the doctrine of natural law, as in the case of John Locke. Hayek seems to be unaware of this great tradition of thought, which played such an important role in the growth of liberal ideas, in safeguarding the intangible individual sphere, and in limiting the powers of the state, and which, we should not forget, contributed so much to the history of constitutionalism itself, given the links between natural rights, contractualism, and constitutionalism. As it happens, this subject is more complex than first appears. We have to bear in mind that Hayek uses evolutionary premises as a starting point for his thinking about the rule of law and law in general. It represents one of the greatest expressions of the tradition of spontaneous order developed by Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson in the Scottish Enlightenment, and which, continued by Edmund Burke, led to Friedrich Karl von Savigny, Henry Maine, and Karl Menger and the Austrian School of Economics. In Hayek's work, the fundamental concept, and one of his most original ideas, is that of cultural evolution, which has to do with the origin and development of institutions such as religion, law, the market, and, in general, self-generating and self-regulating systems that shape a complex society. In this sense, for Hayek, rights are certainly not natural, but, given that they have evolved spontaneously, they cannot be termed artificial either. A starting point in Hayek's thought is the false dichotomy between natural and artificial, the latter term identifying the product of an intended project. This dichotomy obstructs the correct understanding of the process of cultural evolution that produced our traditions and our civilization. There is, however, an intermediate category of phenomena resulting from human action but not from human planning. Following the reasoning of the late scholastics, the Spanish Jesuits who used the term naturalis to indicate social phenomena that had evolved over time, Hayekian teaching explains that in this sense, our traditional, spontaneously evolved morals are perfectly natural rather than artificial, and it would seem fitting to call such traditional rules natural laws. In other words, something is natural if it has evolved spontaneously over time. What is important is to go beyond the false dichotomy that, by considering anything driven by a conscious plan as artificial and anything with instinctive characteristics as natural, brings us inevitably to a rationalist constructivism. This is why Hayek deplores the fact that the early signs of an evolutionist model to explain society have been abandoned in favor of a different conception of natural law understood as rationalist law, a law according to reason. These are the theoretical premises that led Hayek to question some entrenched views in the history of political institutions. First and foremost is the idea that a normative system has been intentionally created by someone or is the result of an explicit agreement. For Hayek, both the assumption that a right is the fruit of the famous Bodinian sovereignty, the power to make and break laws, and the contractualist assumption are only the result of a constructivist rationalism that stands in the way of a correct understanding of the evolution of political and social institutions. It is a short step to the criticism of legal positivism, which, in fact, proves on examination to be entirely based on what we have called the constructivist fallacy. It is actually one of the main offshoots of that rationalist constructivism which, in taking literally the expression that man has made all his culture and institutions, has been driven to the fiction that all law is the product of somebody's will. In the field of law, Hayek wants to rehabilitate the evolutionist teachings of Edward Coke and Matthew Hale, in stark contrast with Thomas Hobbes or, in more recent times, with Hans Kelsen. This is how things like jus gentium, mercantile law, the customary laws practiced at fairs, and common law took the form of a cosmos, that is, of a spontaneous order that made use of the knowledge scattered among different individuals, and in which no single mind had a planning or coordinating role. Following Nicola Matteucci's ideas, it is therefore possible to conceive a Hayekian position that is not in direct contrast with the concept of natural law, understood, obviously, in terms of cultural evolution. Matteucci underlines the fact that for Koch and the English jurists, there was no contrast between natural law and common law, because the latter was simply the implementation of the natural law principles, from which it developed historically over the centuries and with the consensus of many generations. It is precisely in this sense that Edward Koch was able to write that the common law expressed the perfection of reason. Because by many successions of ages it hath been fined and refined by an infinite number of grave and learned men, and by long experience grown to a such perfection. In a customary constitution, reason is immanent, but not the abstract reason of the rationalists, it is rather historical reason in which, in the English legal and political tradition, there is less of a rigid contrast between nature and history. In Matteucci's opinion, even John Locke's great work on natural law essentially speaks of a tradition that became rationalized and universal. Once again, we find the idea that what is natural is that which has evolved. However, the question of the relationship between Hayek and natural law is certainly not easy to define. For example, Charles Cavell came to place Hayek among the defenders of natural law, although he makes it clear that he considers Hayek a defender of natural law by virtue of his opposition to legal positivism, rather than for any connection with the natural law tradition, which is totally lacking in Hayek's work. Cavell says that there is another perspective from which Hayek refers to a natural model, a perspective that is, in a certain sense, linked to Matteucci's ideas. Cavell writes, Hayek constructed an essentially naturalistic model of law which looked back to the tradition in legal philosophy of Koch and Blackstone. In this way, Hayek rejects both legal positivism, for its constructivism, and also the idea of the rule of law based on a voluntarist model derived from Thomas Hobbes. William Blackstone makes a particular use of the concept of natural law when, in order to demonstrate the moral basis of the English legal system, he defines English law as being based on the principles of natural law, established by God, that the human mind is able to discover. As a result, the common law had been developed, or rather discovered, by the English courts in accordance with procedures of adjudication in which legal rules and precedents were established through an application to individual cases of the principles of morality and reasonableness that ran through the whole structure of English law. Thus, we find a reasonableness not unlike Edward Koch's reason, which is founded in the common law by virtue of the historical process through which it has developed. Hayek favors English common law, law discovered by the judges, creating a spontaneous order. On the contrary, he is against the idea that had taken root in absolutist states, that the act of making and breaking laws is the essence of sovereignty, a deliberate act of the sovereign's will. Hayek also takes issue with Cartesian-based rationalism. This school of thought ignores the distinction between taxis and cosmos, i.e., between systems and associations whose formal structure is characterized by a constructed order, and those systems that, on the contrary, developed and took root by means of an evolutionary process and which could therefore be defined as spontaneous orders. Constructivist rationalism concentrates its attention exclusively on the institutions of the first type, overlooking the fact that intentionally constructed forms of human association are often supported on the wider base of a spontaneous order. Hayek counts the common law legal system among those that can be characterized as a cosmos, and ascribes it to the evolutionary rationalism that led to the configuration of the natural process that Cavell defines as legal naturalism. Cavell explains that, in this sense, for Hayek, law and legal institutions should be examined in their relation to the processes which govern the evolution of the customary and tradition-based practices embedded in actual historical communities. Having said this, it should nevertheless be emphasized that Hayek is above all a great defender of the rule of law and that he prefers the concept of cultural evolution to that of human nature. The truly irreconcilable points between the evolutionist theory of law and Rothbard's adherence to the concept of natural law are rationalism and fallibilism. One of Rothbard's severest reprimands is, in fact, Hayek's continuous and all-pervasive attack on reason. In reality, Hayek's attack is against the abuse of reason, against the constructive rationalism that leads to an infinite faith in the capacity of human reason to shape social and political institutions as it pleases. In order to avoid any misunderstandings, it should be noted that Hayek is not an anti-rationalist, saying, "It is therefore better in this connection not to distinguish between rationalism and anti-rationalism but to distinguish between a constructivist and an evolutionary, or, in Karl Popper's terms, a naive and critical rationalism." Given these premises, Rothbard is unable to share the Hayekian idea of true and false individualism, which contrasts a rationalist tradition that is mainly French, in the Cartesian mold and moving toward a constructivist presumption, with a British, evolutionist, empirical and truly liberal tradition connected by Hayek to the Whig tradition. Rothbard criticizes the fact that thinkers of the caliber of Thomas Jefferson, Richard Price, Joseph Priestley, and Thomas Paine were undervalued and seen as terrible rationalists. Rothbard makes a further comment, and one that seems justified, concerning Hayek's having overlooked the French liberal thinkers of the 19th century, such as Frédéric Bastiat, Gustave de Molinari, and Charles Dunoyer. Molinari, of course, was Belgian but was closely associated with the French liberals. Ralph Raico recently made a similar criticism of the Hayekian categories of true and false individualism, among other things highlighting the fact that there is a great liberal tradition in France, represented by Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Jean-Baptiste Say, besides the above-mentioned Bastiat, Molinari, and Dunoyer. Thus, faith in the rational capacities of man to discover and correctly interpret the laws of nature and absolute ethical values is not really compatible with the evolutionist and fallibilist position. The foundations of liberty are completely different for Hayek and Rothbard. Hayek bases the reasons for liberty on our ignorance. The necessary starting point for his theory of a liberal society is fallibility, partiality, and the scattering of knowledge among particular situations in time and place among millions and millions of people. Given this, liberty becomes a direct consequence of the sharing and spreading of knowledge, which is a necessary condition for the unique and limited knowledge of individuals to be used in the best way. A liberal society in which there is peaceful cooperation and the division of labor is one that can make use of so much more knowledge than the mind of the wisest ruler could comprehend. The value of individual liberty rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of all of us concerning a great many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depends. If there were omniscient men, if we could know not only all that affects the attainment of our present wishes but also our future wants and desires, there would be little case for liberty. Liberty is essential in order to leave room for the unforeseeable and unpredictable. We want it because we have learned to expect from it the opportunity of realizing many of our aims. For Rothbard, on the other hand, human ignorance is too uncertain a basis for liberty. According to the authentic rationalist theory, we should be able to know what is best for man and to found absolute values on human nature. Rothbard dismisses the Hayekian premises as an attack on man's reason. It seems to me, however, that precisely on this point, Rothbard's position is even more debatable. The proposed anchoring of absolute values on a hypothetical eternal and unchanging kind of human nature raises legitimate questions. Norberto Bobbio, a supporter of the historicity of rights, contests the possibility of effectively searching for an absolute foundation when he says, "For centuries this illusion was common among advocates of the natural law, who believed they had safeguarded certain rights from any possible confutation by deducing them from human nature, although the rights were not always the same. However, human nature has proved to be a very shaky foundation on which to build an absolute principle for incontrovertible rights. Human rights constitute a variable category, as is adequately demonstrated by the history of the last few centuries. The list of human rights has been modified and continues to be modified in changing historical circumstances, the requirements and interests of the ruling classes, the available means for their enactment, technological developments, etc., thus rights are not fundamental by their nature. That which appears to be fundamental in a given historical era or civilization, is not fundamental in other eras or civilizations. Guido Faso emphasizes the role played by the doctrine of natural law as a means of rationalizing the law and as a basis for constitutionalism, but he adds that in order to preserve its function as a bulwark of liberty, natural law must stop trying to express a system of absolute values, given for all time, outside history. This is an invitation to recover an awareness of the historical and evolutionary character of law. Faso goes on to say that it would be ingenuous to mistake the values held in one age, and valid for that age, for eternal and immutable values. Thus, the attempt to establish what is absolutely good for man by appealing to human nature, which would really seem to be a cultural idea, demonstrates the great distance between Rothbard and Hayek's evolutionary argument. In this sense, Rothbard's criticism of Hayek is paradigmatic of the split we find today within the Austrian school of economics between the libertarians who refer back to Locke's version of the idea of right reason that enables an understanding of natural law, and the heirs of the theory, typical of the Austrian school, of a limited, fallible, and evolutionist kind of knowledge. This contrast, already evident in the writings under consideration here, is made explicit and theorized more fully by Rothbard in his 1992 The Present State of the Austrian School of Economics, from which the profound differences between the various paradigms within the Austrian school emerge. In this paper, Rothbard takes his distance from Hayek's entire work, in that it is devoted to a denigration of human reason. Rothbard rightly points out that not all that has evolved spontaneously is consistent with a system of liberty and an open society. It would therefore be a mistake to accept passively all conventions and customs for the simple reason that they have already been established. According to the idea of cultural evolution, over the passage of time, the customs and institutions that take root are those best suited to the survival and development of a social group. Thus, if the Rothbardian criticism of Hayek as a historian of political thought does not seem to grasp the essence of his reflections, Rothbard does, however, highlight one of the more problematic areas of Hayek's work. It is not only questionable whether the best institutions are always the ones to succeed, but there is also the problem of the long period of time required for the necessary changes to take place in any unfair institutions or customs. As a matter of fact, Hayek does not rule out the possibility of deliberate legislative corrections. The fact that all law arising out of the necessity to articulate rules of conduct will of necessity possess some desirable properties not necessarily possessed by the commands of a legislator does not mean that in other respects, such law may not develop in very undesirable directions, and that when this happens correction by deliberate legislation may not be the only practicable way out. For a variety of reasons the spontaneous process of growth may lead into an impasse from which it cannot extricate itself by its own forces or which it will at least not correct quickly enough, but such occasions when it is recognized that some hereto accepted rules are unjust in the light of more general principles of justice may well require the revision not only of single rules but whole sections of the established system of case law. Therefore, even if reason does not have a planning and creative role in the field of the establishment of institutions, it is able and indeed has to play a corrective role. Cavell underlines the fact that Hayek is not really barrenly anchored to tradition, rather he recognizes the fact that a system of predominantly judge-made law, such as English law, always stood in need of correction and amendment through an institutional procedure of statutory legislation. Moreover, it is perhaps worth noting that the concept of evolution is not completely foreign to Rothbardian ideas, even if it is not one of his characteristic lines of thought. In For a New Liberty, Rothbard makes reference to the development of the common law when he considers the possibility of a libertarian legal code. In doing so, Rothbard uses the same theoretical instruments as Bruno Leoni, who, as Rimando Cubedo notes, assimilates the rule of law to the very same process of spontaneous social evolution that includes the market, religion, law and language. On this basis, Rothbard thinks that Hayek is a conservative, even if Hayek denies this in his concluding essay in The Constitution of Liberty, Why I Am Not a Conservative. Explaining the reasons he rejects conservatism, Hayek writes, "The main point about liberalism is that it wants to go elsewhere, not to stand still. It has never been a backward-looking doctrine. Liberalism is not averse to evolution and change, and where spontaneous change has been smothered by government control, it wants a great deal of change of policy. It would seem to the liberal, indeed, that what is most urgently needed in most parts of the world is a thorough sweeping away of the obstacles to free growth." The admiration of the conservatives for free growth generally applies only to the past. One of the fundamental traits of the conservative attitude is a fear of change, a timid distrust of the new as such. It is, indeed, part of the liberal attitude to assume that, especially in the economic field, the self-regulating forces of the market will somehow bring about the required adjustments to new conditions, although no one can foretell how they will do this in a particular instance. Besides, Hayek's attitude toward American institutions makes clear his position regarding tradition. He explains that to the liberal they are valuable not mainly because they are long established or because they are American but because they correspond to the ideals which he cherishes. Thus, Hayek denies being a conservative, since he believes in free competition and in change. As observed by Sergio Ricorsa in his introduction to the Italian edition of the Constitution of Liberty, when you are for life, free growth, and spontaneous evolution, it is not possible to have greater esteem for a conservative party in the strict sense than a driver has for the brakes of his car, even if they are extremely useful. The authors of the introduction to the Italian edition of Law, Legislation, and Liberty find the demarcation line between conservatism and Hayekian thought in the fact that the great value of tradition lies, for Hayek, in its rational nature, because it has developed by means of an evolutionary and competitive process. In this way, the value of tradition does not consist in the mere fact of there being traditions, a characteristic feature of authentic conservative and reactionary thought. Criticism of the concept of coercion in Hayek. The concept of coercion is one of the issues that arouses Rothbard's polemic force. He in part approves of Hayek's initial definition of liberty as an absence of interpersonal coercion, but he considers that it marks the beginning of Hayek's descent into the abyss. For Rothbard, the idea of coercion as a threat or intent to harm is excessively broad since it would allow the possibility of identifying both a variety of coercive situations requiring protection by the government, but also a whole range of government activities that are not really coercive. Here, it is first of all necessary to clear up a misunderstanding. As Hayek was keen to emphasize, the most significant thing in the Constitution of Liberty is not so much the definition of liberty as an absence of coercion, but rather as that condition of men in which coercion of some by others is reduced as much as is possible in society. Rothbard felt that coercion was the use of physical violence or the threat thereof. According to Hayek, by coercion we mean such control of the environment or circumstances of a person by another that, in order to avoid greater evil, he is forced to act not according to a coherent plan of his own, but to serve the ends of another. He goes on to say that, coercion occurs when one man's actions are made to serve another man's will, not for his own but for the other's purpose. Hayek gave some examples to show clear cases of coercion, for example, the case of dismissal or threat of dismissal in periods of widespread unemployment, or in a mining town where the only possible work is as a miner. However, in Rothbard's opinion, these cases do not demonstrate coercion, since the mine owner is only exercising his legitimate right of refusing to make any further exchanges with one or more people. Another example of coercion given by Hayek was the case of the sole owner of a spring in an oasis, who forces the local inhabitants to accept arbitrary conditions in order to obtain any water. Yet another possible case is that of the only doctor available who, in the face of a serious epidemic, refuses to treat any patients or requests exorbitant fees. In these cases, Rothbard thought that the subjects in question were simply exercising their own rights of private property or their rights to choose whether to engage in professional relations or not. Hayek nevertheless maintains that these are cases in which coercive government action would be justified in order to avoid a worse kind of coercion. He considers that some goods and services are essential for survival, and therefore, it is because these services are regarded as rights to be counted upon that a refusal to render them except on unusual terms is justly regarded as a harmful alteration of the environment and therefore as coercion. Hayek's point is that in any case coercion cannot be altogether avoided, because the only way to prevent it is by the threat of coercion. Free society has met this problem by conferring the monopoly of coercion on the state, and by attempting to limit this power of the state to instances where it is required to prevent coercion by private persons. This is possible only by the states protecting known private spheres of the individuals against interference by others and delimiting these private spheres, not by specific assignation, but by creating conditions under which the individual can determine his own sphere by relying on rules which tell him what the government will do in different types of situations. For Rothbard, however, the point is not to try to reduce coercion to a minimum by means of acts of coercion, but rather to eliminate it entirely, in that it is unjust and immoral. Rothbard's position is usually of an integral kind, one that brooks no compromise. Obviously, he rejects the idea that a free society could grant the state a monopoly on coercion and that it could thus defend individuals from coercion, since, in his opinion, the state is itself the principal aggressor in society. Therefore, since liberty requires the elimination of aggressive violence in society, the state is not, and can never be, justified as a defender of liberty. For the state lives by its very existence on the twofold and pervasive employment of aggressive violence against the very liberty and property of individuals that it is supposed to be defending. In Rothbard's second comment on Constitution of Liberty, he gives a long list of state activities that Hayek considers justified and that he himself rejects categorically. These are functions ranging from public health to state provision of roads, state aid for the poor, government subsidies in the public interest, obligatory old age pensions, and also include conscription in the event of foreign aggression, and many other typical government activities. Conscription, for example, is one of those issues about which libertarians are totally intransigent, considering it a form of downright slavery. Hayek, instead, thinks it is certainly a very severe form of coercion, but one that could be justified to ward off the danger of worse coercion by an external enemy. The question of public health and of various kinds of welfare for the poor is part of the particular Hayekian concept of solidarity. Hayek feels that it goes without saying that the state should take care of those unable to provide for themselves and that a minimum level of subsistence should be guaranteed for all so that no member of society would lack for food, shelter, and medical treatment. Apart from proven cases of need that should rightly be borne by society as a whole, in reality Hayek proposes solutions to social security problems that are not based on a state monopoly for certain activities. He only opts for obligatory insurance in fields such as old age pensions and health care, on the basis of the observation that if certain state activities enjoy a monopoly, the result is usually not only that those advantages soon prove illusory but that the character of the services becomes entirely different from that which they would have had if provided by competing agencies. In this way, the benefits of competition are lost and certain services become the dominion of bureaucratic hierarchies. For Hayek, it is precisely in order to safeguard some individuals from suffering coercion that state activities cannot be limited to maintaining law and order. Obligatory insurance, which Rothbard sees as invading the sphere of an individual's liberty, means that the other members of society are not obliged to provide for other members in need. The Hayekian argument concerning solidarity is linked to a particular conception. In a society in which the protective institutions of traditional society are no longer able to provide a safety net, it is only right that the community should assume the burden of the most critical situations. The legitimate functions of the state cannot be limited to ensuring observance of the law and defending the country against external enemies. There is, however, yet another class of common risks with regard to which the need for government has until recently not been generally admitted, and where as the result of the dissolution of the ties of the local community, and of the development of a highly mobile open society, an increasing number of people are no longer closely associated with particular groups whose help and support they can count upon in the case of misfortune. The problem here is chiefly the fate of those who for various reasons cannot make their living in the market, such as the sick, the old, the physically or mentally defective, the widows and orphans, that is all people suffering from adverse conditions which may affect anyone and against which most individuals cannot alone make adequate provision, but in which a society that has reached a certain level of wealth can afford to provide for all. The assurance of a certain minimum income for everyone, or a sort of floor below which nobody need fall even when he is unable to provide for himself, appears not only to be wholly legitimate protection against a risk common to all, but a necessary part of the great society in which the individual no longer has specific claims on the members of the particular small group into which he was born. Hayek justifies the fact that the state raises funds through taxation in order to offer a whole range of services that, for various reasons, cannot be supplied by the market. Regarding, for example, the management of public leisure services, theaters, public parks, or goods of cultural value, he favors decentralized management, not control at the national level. Alternatively, management could be entrusted to private institutions that would act as intermediaries, albeit he has no objections in principle to the public management of these goods. A particularly sensitive point on which Hayek manages to provoke Rothbard's criticism is education. Hayek is obviously not in favor of a state monopoly on education, since he is well aware of the dangers inherent in uniformity. He is for the widest possible pluralism, and for competition in the field of education. He writes, indeed, the very possibility that, with a system of government education, all elementary education may come to be dominated by the theories of a particular group, should be sufficient to warn us of the risks involved in subjecting the whole educational system to central direction. Nevertheless, not only is he in favor of compulsory school attendance, but he also approves of the school voucher system proposed by Milton Friedman. So, while he rules out a state educational system, he accepts the idea of public funding for schools. He says that this does not mean, however, that compulsory education or even government-financed general education today requires the educational institutions to be run by the government. As has been shown by Professor Milton Friedman, it would now be entirely practicable to defray the costs of general education out of the public purse without maintaining government schools, by giving the parents vouchers covering the costs of education for each child which they could hand over to schools of their choice. It may still be desirable that government directly provide schools in a few isolated communities where the number of children is too small, but with respect to the great majority of the population, it would undoubtedly be possible to leave the organization and management of education entirely to private efforts, with the government providing merely the basic finance and ensuring a minimum standard for all schools where the vouchers could be spent. These ideas are included on Rothbard's list of Hayek's partisan biases at the end of Rothbard's review, Letter on the Constitution of Liberty by F.A. von Hayek. For this anarcho-capitalist, these are positions he cannot share, since in his opinion, any public funding, and indeed anything pertaining to the state, should simply cease to exist. Thus, for Rothbard, Hayek has not reached the target of establishing and defending liberty. The principle of the rule of law is itself too vague a concept and in any case insufficient as a principle on which to base the defense of liberty. For Hayek, the rule of law is the principal instrument with which to defend individual liberty. He explains that, the rule of law constitutes a limitation on the powers of all government, including the powers of the legislature. For the rule of law to prevail in a society, each law must meet certain basic requirements. It has to be general and abstract, known and certain and, lastly, it has to be the same for all. The function of the rule of law is to create the conditions within which individuals can act freely and follow their own goals on the basis of their own knowledge. Hayek feels that, the task of the lawgiver is not to set up a particular order but merely to create conditions in which an orderly arrangement can establish and ever renew itself. Hayek's response to Ronald Hamoy's criticisms provides a useful explanation of the function of the rule of law. It is the distinguishing mark of the Western political tradition that coercion has been confined to instances where it is required by general abstract rules, known beforehand and equally applicable to all. Combined with the requirement that such general rules authorizing coercion could be justified only by the general purpose of preventing worse coercion. This principle seems to be as effective a method of minimizing coercion as mankind has yet discovered. It seems to me the best protection yet devised against that administrative despotism which is the greatest danger to individual liberty today. Letter on the Constitution of Liberty by F.A. Hayek. June 11, 1960. Mr. Kenneth S. Templeton. William Volker Fund. Dear Ken. F.A. Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty is a work monumental in its scope and invaluable for the extent of its erudition. Of the 25 chapters in the complete work, I reviewed 14 in detail in draft form. See my confidential memorandum of January 21, 1958, and my critique for Hayek sent to you on January 24, 1958. The major change in those chapters is the far greater breadth of the footnotes, which now become an invaluable reference source for people wishing to dig further into the literature on liberty. Hayek's work may be divided into 3 parts: philosophical, historical, and economic applications. His aim is to erect a groundwork for a theory and systematic approach to liberty. Unfortunately, Hayek fails in this aim, in all 3 departments. Philosophically, Hayek grounds freedom solely on the shaky reed of man's ignorance. There are good arguments to be drawn for leaving all roads open so that knowledge can expand, but this hardly deserves the exclusive reliance that Hayek places on it. So concerned is Hayek to oppose rationalism as the threat to liberty, that he abandons any attempt for a rationalist groundwork for liberty. While Hayek has improved on his previous draft slightly, in richness of material and in qualifying particularly poor passages, there is no substantive change in his position. As before, Hayek begins very well in the first chapter by defining freedom as meaning absence of coercion, but fails badly in defining coercion. For Hayek, coercion is defined as arbitrary, specifically harmful acts. The term is thus used much more broadly and yet more narrowly than its proper definition, the use of violence. Hence, Hayek can say that for a factory to fire a worker in a place where unemployment is heavy, or to threaten to fire him, is an act of coercion, on the same level as actual acts of violence. Hayek's only principle of non-coercion for government is the rule of law, on which he places exclusive reliance. In such a chapter as Chapter, The Decline of the Law, Hayek is excellent in attacking modern legal philosophers who push the state in a socialistic direction beyond the rule, such as Kelsen and the legal positivists, and Harold Lasky. However, Hayek spends virtually equal emphasis on attacking those who would narrow the rule to limit government activity to defense of life, liberty, and property. Hayek attacks this as an extreme, unduly narrow, etc., view of the role of government. To Hayek, laissez-faire is almost as bad an outgrowth of rationalism as is socialism. This book makes clear to me, as the first 14 chapters of the draft did not, that Hayek's rule of law limits are even looser than I had thought. For not only does he admit at one point that the rule of law cannot be precisely defined, and that it must be suspended in emergencies, but he also would only apply the rule to what Hayek calls coercive activities of the state. There is a vast area of state activity which Hayek calls non-coercive and where the state can act perfectly legitimately. Coercive activities are thus confined to such direct acts of tyranny as price controls, fixing production, socialist planning, etc. But a government supply of a service, such as public housing, etc. is not considered coercive, and therefore cannot be opposed on principle according to Hayek. For such non-coercive activities, says Hayek, the proposed activity must be considered case by case, ad hoc, in a pragmatic, utilitarian manner. Furthermore, Even such clearly coercive activities of the government as conscription are not considered really coercive by Hayek because they are general rules, applying to everyone in a certain defined category, although, as Hayek sometimes admits, these categories can be widened and narrowed flexibly. Everyone knows in advance that he will be drafted, he can predict it, etc. Of course, in practice, the draft is neither universal nor predictable, but that is another problem. Hayek's devotion to the relatively unimportant rule of law principle, and his hostility to rationalism, distort his historical sections, so as to make them virtually valueless, although, as I said above, the footnote references are most important. Thus, Hayek tries to erect the categories of the English tradition, good, and the French tradition, bad. Jefferson, Paine, Price, etc. fine libertarians all, are dismissed hostilely as being in the bad French tradition, while their direct ancestor, John Locke, is hailed as a good English empiricist. Actually, there was little difference between them. Condorcet, surely a bad French rationalist by Hayek's standards, somehow comes out good because he favored a constitution for France and is therefore supposed to be in favor of the rule of law. And while favoring the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights and the Ninth Amendment, as defending liberty, Hayek erroneously considers the American Revolution to be really conservative, and far worse, defends the New Deal Supreme Court for correcting the extreme views of the old Supreme Court in outlawing interventionary measures, etc. Most grievous omission of all, for a historical discussion of libertarian thought, is the complete failure to discuss the really libertarian French thinkers of the 19th century, Bastiat, Molinari, Dunoyer, etc. For these rationalist, pure libertarians would have revealed Hayek's error in identifying rationalism and tyranny, and in placing such faith in the 18th century English old Whigs. Even the 19th century classical economists of England are too French for Hayek's taste, although it is impossible to see how Benthamite utilitarianism can be French. It was original with Bentham. Hayek's unfortunate rationalist French versus Whiggish British traditions, makes him neglect all the really important problems in a history of libertarian thought, for example, the split between the natural rights and the utilitarian traditions of liberty. Both of these schools of thought are virtually ignored. This book is thus a tragic failure, despite the many profound passages scattered through the book, despite the wealth of references, and despite the isolated chapters that have much net value. These are Chapter 1, Defining Liberty and Attacking the Socialistic Definitions, Chapter 8, Unemployment, Independence, and the Role of the Intellectuals, Chapter 16, On the Modern Decline of the Rule of Law, Chapter 20, which, though advocating fallacious proportional taxation, is valuable on balance for its fine criticisms of progressive taxation, and the postscript, which has much keen critique of conservatism, although its positive position is a weak, ultimately pragmatic Whiggism. It is, in fine, a tragic failure because, setting out in this big book to establish a groundwork and a system for liberty, this is precisely what Hayek fails to do and which constitutes his chief error. He has no principle for liberty, his only principle is the rule of law, and this, weak anyway, is so vitiated and qualified that, by the end, there is virtually no principle remaining. This lack of principle can best be shown by a list I have compiled from the book, setting forth Hayek's partisan biases stemming from his odd concept of the state's non-coercive activities, and from his defining coercion peculiarly to include neighborhood effects on others' property, etc. The following is the list of Hayek's specific partisan biases in economic applications of his theory. Hayek favors the following: small black square, requiring monopolists not to discriminate in price among his customers. Small black square, government sanitation. Small black square, government roads. Small black square, compulsory jury service, which he considers non-coercive. Small black square, compulsory deputizing of constables, also, as I've said, conscription is non-coercive. Small black square, government enforcement of religious conformity in an age when people believe that the collective community is responsible for everyone's actions against God. For example, if people believe that homosexuals would bring down the wrath of Sodom and Gomorrah upon them, homosexuality should be outlawed. Small black square, government enforcement of rules of conduct in public places, a vague endorsement. Small black square, suspension of liberty in emergencies, for example, the right of habeas corpus. In the public interest. Small black square, the clear and present danger invasion of free speech. Small black square, government subsidies in the public interest, for example, for defense. Small black square, government supplying of a monetary system. Small black square, government supplying of standards, weights and measures. Small black square, government supplying of statistics. Small black square, government surveying. Small black square, government sanitary services. Small black square, government health services. Small black square, municipal services. Small black square, government public works which individuals would not pay for. Small black square, many government enterprises, so long as they are not compulsorily monopolistic. Small black square, factory acts, and other government regulations of production. Small black square, interference with absolute private property in land. Small black square, failure of government to enforce gambling contracts. Small black square, government aid to the indigent, up to a minimum of subsistence for everyone, and this minimum keeps rising along with the general standard of living. Small black square, government subsidies for scientific research, other experiments. Small black square, municipal government parks. Small black square, municipal government museums. Small black square, municipal government theaters. Small black square, municipal government sports facilities. Small black square, outlawing of peaceful secondary strikes and boycotts. Small black square, collective bargaining, on work rules which Hayek fails completely to realize are hindrances on production and on management's private property, and which he identifies as extensions of the rule of law to industry. Small black square, collective bargaining on wage differentials. Note, collective bargaining should not be outlawed, but an economist should realize its economic evils and its lack of advantages. Small black square, outlawing of voluntary closed shop yellow dog contracts. Small black square, compulsory old age insurance. Small black square, compulsory unemployment insurance. Hayek favors federal compulsion on everyone to take out insurance, rather than for the government to insure everyone directly itself. However, he would supplement this with temporary federal aid and subsidy to private insurance companies for such insurance. All this he would do along the lines of existing compulsory automobile insurance, which he also favors. Further, while opposed to the existing federal Social Security program, Hayek is against scrapping it entirely, now that it is set up, and only favors a gradual transformation of the present system into his proposed system. Hayek is also against a monetary policy so tight as to lead to protracted unemployment, even though he sees that unions would be responsible for this unemployment. Small black square, an odd maximum limit on proportional taxation which would only be the percentage of national income extracted by the government. Thus, if the government decides to extract 50% of the national income, his proposed maximum would be 50%. Hayek favors central banking and is opposed to a free market money. He is against the return to a gold standard. Instead he favors governmental stabilization of the price level, including in such measures a commodity reserve standard. Hayek also believes that absolute private property rights are invalid in cities, and advocates larger municipal ownership. He favors the following: small black square, town planning by government, to coordinate neighborhoods, etc. Small black square, town planners. A. Taxing property owners who gain by their measures even though the individual property owner may be opposed to the measure. B. Subsidizing the losers. Small black square, the right of expropriation of private property by government, right of eminent domain, etc., provided it is at fair compensation. The fair compensation, of course, to be determined by government. He concedes that the Henry George single tax plan would be fine if only there could be clearly separated in practice the site value from the improvement value of land. He favors small black square, governmental building codes, and minimum safety regulation. Small black square, compulsory expropriation of land. Small black square, federal government parks, and nature reservations. Small black square, federal government spreading of agricultural knowledge to farmers. Small black square, compulsory minimum education for children, with government of course setting the minimum standards. Small black square, government aid for education of the poor. He seems to adopt the Friedman plan for government financing of every parent, who can choose his own private school, thus eliminating the need for public schools. Of course, the private schools would have to meet governmental minimum standards. However, he doesn't go as far as the Friedman plan, because Hayek A. wants to retain public schools in isolated districts where private schools would not pay. B. in retrospect, favors public schools for 19th-century America, when transportation was poorer, and where public schools were needed to Americanize the immigrants compulsorily. Small black square, academic freedom and tenure in colleges. Small black square, government, federal aid to higher education especially of general scientists and scholars. Small black square, government special taxation of slum property. Cordially, Murray.